Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was May 11th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Moltcara Compagnona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. Let's begin today's document. Today's document is going to take us deep into some economic history, and, well, just brace yourself. But before we get into the content of the document, we're going to talk about some of its features, its apparatus, you could say. So the document for today is long. It's like 4 pages long, and this is one that Daniel Girona y Llagostera had identified in his itinerary for Joan. And it's one that seems to be just very much about the money and not really having to do with my main research question all that centrally, except at the very beginning we have something really weird. This is in Joan's register, his secret seal register, just like yesterday's. And at the beginning of the document, we have a word above the main text block, and it's been crossed out. And that word, though, is still very legible, and it is Regina, the queen. So that's super interesting. The probata at the very end of this document, so we're talking about folio 65V of Register 1751. The probata is a very simple probata. It's one that you would expect to see if the king had been in charge of this document, and basically the scribe wrote it down normally. And it is Dominus Rex mandavit mihi Pere de Beniore. So the scribe, Pere de Beniore, and he's just saying the king commanded this of me. And we don't have a chancellor or anybody in the end of this document. We have instead a ring. We've got the annulo sub signatus. And so, but then we have nostro and a word that I can't quite figure out at the very end of this letter. I think that the sense of it is I have used my ring in order to sign this. So we have at the end of the document a pretty clear and typical kind of statement about the king having authorized the stuff that has preceded. But then at the very beginning, we've got a kind of ghostly presence of the queen up above the document on folio 64R. And then on the left, we have a mysterious marginal note. The part at the beginning of the marginal note that's squished into the binding is actually, in my opinion, easier to read than what comes after. The part that's squished into the binding is Regina. So that's the abbreviation for queen. If it were Rex, it would be a much more clear shape of an X, I think. And then what follows is pretty difficult to interpret. I don't even know what that is. Maybe with a little bit more practice I could come back to this document. So the document itself is unusual because it starts out in Latin and then it switches to Catalan in line 4. And then at the end, about 10 lines from the end of the document, it switches back into Latin. Actually, I should rephrase that. It's really almost all of the document that's on the last folio of this document, this 4-pager. So pretty much everything in this document on folio 65V is in Latin. And I think that that's because what this document establishes is a pretty serious financial relationship. We don't have time to go over every single clause here, and I might come back to this later, but I have a couple things to point out in this initial run-through stage as I'm just kind of thinking through what this document might mean for my research question. The general sense of the document is that there's a merchant who is going to be handing over a whole lot of money to the, well, I guess you could say the procurator for the royal family, the king's procurator, who we've encountered before. And his name is Lobet, I think. Berengar, might be a Bernard Lobet, or maybe a Bartholomew Lobet. Oh gosh, it's in there somewhere. Okay, so the person's name, the merchant who's going to be handing over all this money, is Pere de Muntros, who has to be related to the person who was granted the administrative position of collecting tithes in yesterday's document, Johann de Muntros. So maybe they're brothers, maybe it's a father and son, but I just don't think it could be a coincidence that these two people with the same surname are not connected familially in some way. The agreement starts out, this document starts out by naming the treasurer of the king. That would be a Pere Marcades, and then naming Pere de Muntros. So they kind of sound a little bit similar. And Pere de Muntros is identified as a merchant and resident of Barcelona. And then it goes on to establish all kinds of terms and processes for how Pere de Muntros will be providing money to the king's procurator, and then how payments will be made back to him as time goes on. So one of the interesting things that I found in this document, in our long list of terms and processes, is that on the second page of the document, folio 64V, in line 11 we have a phrase, per fortuna de temps. So, for the fortune of time. So there's kind of a little bit of wiggle room put in there in that particular clause. Not quite sure what the wiggle room is doing there, but there's something about how the fortune of the time might make some kind of impact in the way that this particular financial agreement plays out. Then I wanted to point out something in the document that's not really about its content, but is an interesting moment on the part of the scribe. In line 15 on folio 65R, which is the third page of this document, we have what looks to be a pretty normal sentence. And then we have a word crossed out. The word that the scribe then wrote afterward is what he had meant to put down originally, and that word is raho, reason. But what he had done, accidentally it seems, is he had written down the Castilian form. Or maybe you could say it would also be Aragonese, I'm not sure. Razón. So, for some reason, as Pere de Benigure was writing this down or copying it from the original, he had a little bit of a brain fart, and where he went was to either Aragonese or Castilian, and instead of just using the Catalan word for rajo, he put down razón. So it's interesting to note that it seems that this could be a signal that Pere de Benigure was writing in Catalan, and when he did, he was using maybe not his native language. I could be just reading into it. It could have just been a weird kind of thing. But usually if somebody accidentally writes something in a language that is not the language that they've been using already in a letter, it stands to reason in my mind that it's because their default is their original language. So that's a guess, and it's just a little quirk that I found in this document. Not quite sure how impactful that is, but I thought I'd point it out. And maybe we'll see later clues about whether Pere de Benigure was a native Aragonese speaker or a native Castilian speaker, and we might later see other pieces of evidence that we have somebody writing in a language that they're not as comfortable with. So the next line also has a cross out, and we have again the word rajo is the word that was supposed to go in there, and this time the word that's been crossed out is not the Castilian or Aragonese version. So it's interesting. He might have just been flummoxed because actually earlier in the line he has another cross out. So he's just a little bit thrown off his game, I think, when he's writing down this next line. But then there's another cross out toward the bottom. So I'm not quite sure what that means, that there seems to be more strike-throughs, cross-outs in this document than others. I don't know what I could say about that. Okay, so we've got some pretty large amounts mentioned in this document. We have something like 200,000 solides mentioned as the amount that is being arranged for here, which is a big amount of money. And so I think at this point it'd be useful to just explain a little bit more about the bigger picture in terms of the economic history of the time. So in 1380, which is 7 years prior to this moment, King Pere de Ceremonias made a rather fateful decision and basically had caused a financial crisis. So the source that I have for this is a historian named Gaspard Feliu y Montfort. So Gaspard Feliu y Montfort had written an article called Finances, Currency, and Taxation. I've quoted from it before in 14th and 15th century 14th and 15th centuries, that's it, in the Catalan Historical Review. And in the course of his explanation of the changes that had happened in taxation and currency in the late 14th century, he centers this event in 1380. What had happened is that Pere the Ceremonious and Joan together had owed a certain creditor, a banking house, more than 314,000 lires. Okay, so there's like 20 solides for each lires, the pound, basically. So 314,000 pounds. Okay, so that's just really a lot of money. And when they realized that it was actually going to be rather hopeless to pay that back, Pere the Ceremonious just said, I'm just not going to do it. You're just SOL. So basically, the bank did some attempts to stay afloat and couldn't. And they struggled on until March of 1381, and then they collapsed. And the reverberation of that through the Barcelona financial industry was severe. So, in response to that, the city of Barcelona stepped up and basically made some additional regulations over the financial sector. And part of those regulations had a gigantic consequence for the royal family, which is that after the collapse of the Bank of Descaus and d'Olivella, which was the name of that creditor that Pere the Ceremonious just stopped paying and said he wasn't going to pay. When that collapse happened, the consequence was that the city of Barcelona really made it a lot more difficult for the monarchs, to take out loans. And so what we're seeing in this year is that they have to really scramble to keep the money flowing. And I think we're seeing documents that reflect that situation. That this is basically 6 years into a new way of life for financing the monarchy. And that's still pretty early in the process. So institutionally, they haven't yet figured out a way to get additional funding for all of the expenses, all the salaries that they have to pay, all of the stuff that they have to buy in order to demonstrate their legitimacy as monarchs, and also to finance a luxurious lifestyle just for the sake of the comfort of luxury. You know, there's a lot of expenses that are required in order to keep this monarchy going. And so without a steady stream of loans, it's not going to happen very easily. And I think we're seeing a lot of examples of the difficulties where, you know, we had Violante writing to Berenguer Dolmes saying, are you going to do the job of going with that tax collector or not? And then also we have the appeal to the Pope to allow for an increase in the amount of tithes that go from the church to the coffers of the monarchy, which we saw in yesterday's document. And then today we have this loan instrument, which I think, I'm not quite sure how this is legally allowed to happen, other than to say that it's probably not a bank, it's just this one merchant. And so there were probably a lot of these situations in which just piecemeal, in just small installments and small deals here and there, Joan and Violante and their treasurers were able to get enough money incoming to pay for all of the expenditures. So all of this trouble is a consequence of what happened in 1380 to 1381 with Pere the Ceremonious. And when we talk about financial responsibility or financial irresponsibility, you have to set the context where basically the old ways of funding just weren't working anymore. And so what are you going to do? And I think there's another dynamic to this, which is that there was a lot of apocalyptic belief. And remember, we're getting kind of close to the end of the century. And when the end of the century is approaching, people start to get very apocalyptic. So there were people who had a lot of prominence in the culture of the Crown of Aragon, and I'm thinking in particular of Francesc Ximenes, who actually put in writing a prediction that there would be an apocalypse in the year 1400, and that the only state that would survive that apocalypse would be France. So, not quite sure how that would have gone down with everybody in the Crown of Aragon, which is where Francesc Ximenes was writing from. But if you are really into apocalyptic belief, then if you're taking out a gigantic loan, then maybe it's not such a big deal, because when, the final bill comes due or when the payments get so high, it's after the apocalypse anyway. So it kind of puts another spin on the decision-making process when we think about decisions made to take out loans at really big interest rates. I can't quite tell from today's document what the interest rate is. I'm not sure it actually says it in here. I feel like it's got to, but it doesn't seem to have. Yeah, I can't quite find it in here. And the translation and transcription was okay from OpenClaw this time, but not to the point where I can answer a question like that. So basically, we're left with, okay, here's just another attempt to get the revenue flowing in this moment when Joan is not really able to maybe do the full kingship routine, not able to travel, not able to administer as much maybe as a normal healthy king would. And I say that only because, if you almost die on April 28th and it's May 11th, okay, maybe you bounced back and you're feeling fine, but I think that's unlikely. And I think that the presence of the word Regina at the beginning of this document shows that it's way more complicated than what the Probata says for this. One last note that I want to make about the overall financial picture is that there's somebody who we haven't talked about for a little while, but pops up in the record every now and then and is a major piece of the puzzle when trying to figure out what was going on with the finances for Joan and Violante. And that person is Luchino Scarampi, the Genoese financier who I think is in Avignon still and is organizing the negotiations still over the betrothal between Joan and Violante's daughter and Louis II of Anjou. Luchino Scarampi, major source of cash for Joan and Violante throughout their reign. So, lots of little streams and big streams of money that we can see in these documents coming in and leaving the coffers of the king and queen. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Maltcara Compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I've done my job. Because remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes, and listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.